Yevamos Daf Ayin Vav contains two Mishnayos, which divides the Daf into three sugyas. The first concludes the sugya of the way we define a Petzua, Daka, and a Kros Shavcha. The Gemara is working on what happens when there is an injury to one of the organs which heals. Is the healing considered to be a recovery of the status of a healthy person, or does the healing not count and the person is still Petzua, Daka, or Kros Shavcha? The Gemara will discuss how you can check if it's healed, how you define healing, and the Gemara will compare it to other halachas. Then we'll get to our first Mishnah on the Daf, which will discuss the topic of who is a Petzua Daka allowed to marry. Are there any other types of psulim which a Petzua Daka is allowed to marry? And the question centers around, does a Petzua Daka lose Kedushas Yisrael? It's considered to be not part of the kohol anymore, or is a Petzua Daka just forbidden from marrying a kosher? The second Mishnah will take us to the topic of Amayni and Mayavi, and the sugya of Amayni v'lei Amaynis, Mayavi v'lei Mayavis, and the Gemara will go through the sugya in Sefer Shmuel, from which we learn this halacha. So let's begin. The Gemara is discussing a injury to the aver, the male organ, which causes the person not to be able to give birth, and therefore he's a Petzua Daka. So the Gemara says, what happens if there was a hole, and the hole is clogged up, either it's healed or it's stuffed by something, and now the person doesn't have a hole anymore. So what's the halacha? So the Gemara says it's got to be that the scar, the healing of the hole, is strong enough that even at the time when he's motzi zera, it doesn't rip open. There's a lot of pressure that's created at that moment. It's got to be able to withstand that time, and therefore he would have a proper zriya, and he is able to give birth. So the Gemara says, first of all, let's define what we're talking about over here. We're obviously talking about hole that is near the end of the aver, because if it's in the beginning, there's no pressure there at the time of zriya. But from the high ridge on the aver towards the end, there's no isser. There's no isser to a Daka. That entire area could be missing and he would still be kosher. So what are we talking about? The Gemara says we're referring to a hole on the atar itself. There is pressure, but the atar itself does count as part of the aver, and if that's missing or has a hole, there's a problem. So the Gemara says, how are we going to check? How are we going to see whether or not the aver can withstand the pressure of zriya, whether the hole will open up or not? So the Gemara says we have to cause the person to be mazriya, have to cause the person to have a seminal emission. Usually that's forbidden. The Igros Moshe explains in one of his chuvas, usually that's forbidden, but we're allowed to do that in order to see if he can marry so that he's able to give birth. We're working towards being able to have children brought into the world. So this is not a waste, this is not Zer Vatala. However, he's not allowed to stimulate himself. That is forbidden. It's a separate Isser, which Moshe calls Niyuf B'yad. So how are we able to cause this person to be motzi zera without physical manipulation? So the Gemara has two suggestions. The Gemara's first suggestion is that you take hot barley bread and you place it on his rear entrance, on his rear exit, and that causes the stimulation of the entire area, and that causes him to be mazriya. So the Gemara says, why do you have to go so far? He's not Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov Avinu was on the level that nothing would cause him. There was no level of here that would cause him to be mazriya. This person is not Yaakov Avinu. You shouldn't need to do that. So the Gemara says that therefore it should just be enough to cause him hirhurim, to cause him thoughts. In order to do that, it just has to show him colored clothing of a woman. So the Gemara says, no, that only works for someone who's very much involved in immoral behavior. That can stimulate him so easily. Somebody like Barzilai Hagiladi, who the Gemara says was very steeped in this type of thing, the Gemara learns that out from the fact that Barzilai was considered to be old at a very young age. He aged prematurely. So the Gemara says it must be that he was too much motzi zera. So, but most people aren't like that, and they're not so easily brought to hotzas zera. So therefore, we have to go with our first answer, and that's to use the hot barley bread. All right, now the Gemara goes to a brisa that says the reason that a hole is a problem is because the zera will come out of the hole and not from its proper exit, and therefore it'll just drip out. It won't flow. It won't shoot. And in order to cause a pregnancy, in order to give birth, it has to shoot out with force. So the Gemara says, though, this brisa says, though, that if it is sealed up, it's kosher, and the reason is because then it'll come out the way it's meant to, with force. So says the Gemara, says the brisa, this is the psul, which can go back to being kosher. So the Gemara asks, this is usually excludes that to some other type of psul, which you may think goes back to being kosher, but it's not. What's that referring to? The Gemara says that's referring to treifas hareya, an animal which has a hole in its lung is treif. If it heals by having the hole sealed by a type of mucousy membrane, that doesn't count. That's not considered to be strong attachment, and that doesn't count. All right, now the Gemara discusses how we can cause the hole in the Aver to heal. So the Gemara has a formula. The Gemara says, Ravid Baravin sent to Abaye, what do you do? And the answer was that you first have to scratch the area with a barley kernel to cause it to stimulate another healing process. You want it to be able to fuse. So you have to stimulate the fusing of the hole. So you scratch it with a barley kernel. The Gemara says not with metal, because that'll cut it. You don't want to do that. And you scratch it. Then you put on some fats. That'll also stimulate the production of the cells to heal the hole, like we do today with Vaseline. Then the Gemara says you take a large ant, you insert its head in the hole. It will bite one side of the hole, then you cut off its head and leave the head in. When it closes up, that head will be part of the fusing, it'll be part of the rebuilding, and it will then seal up in that way. The Gemara says this only works for a small hole. If it's a large hole, however, the sealing won't stay, the scab will just peel off. Okay. Now, the Gemara says the halacha of Rabba bar Ravuna. He says the halacha is that somebody who urinates and it comes out of two holes, one correct and one incorrect, then he's a puzzle. That's the definition of somebody who cannot give birth, he cannot have children. It says Rabba, the halacha is not like this halacha of Rabba. It's also not like a different halacha that Rabba's father, Rav Huna, said. What's that? So Rav Huna said that two women who are engaged in promiscuous behavior with each other, the phraseology is women who rub one against the other. Rashi says refers to also makom. So this activity creates a psul for kahuna. This counts as a zona. It has the halachic status of znus, and therefore it creates a psul for kahuna. Kohanim are not allowed to marry zona. So says Rava, that is not the halacha. It doesn't count as a znus at all. It's just a mitzvah pritzus. It's promiscuous behavior, but it's not as znus. Even according to the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, who defines pani abala pnuya, any type of physical action between a man and a woman which is out of wedlock, he defines that as being znus, but a woman and a woman together is not defined as znus, and therefore does not aser either of them for kahuna. Okay, now we get to our Mishnah. This concludes the Gemara's discussion of defining the injuries of a petua daka. Now the next Mishnah will talk about the halacha of who a petua daka is allowed to marry. So the Mishnah says that Petua Daka and a Koshavcha are allowed to marry a Giores and a Meshucheres. Giores and a Meshucheres are also to Kahanim because they are not defined as part of the Kahol. A Petua Daka and a Koshavcha are not allowed to marry Kahol. It says Lo Yavo Petua Daka Koshavcha Bekahal Hashem. And therefore they are only aser on those that are counted as Kahal Hashem. Giores and the Meshucheres are not counted as Kahal Hashem, and therefore they are allowed to marry them, even though they're full-fledged Jews at the time, but the din kahal doesn't apply to them, and a Petua Daka Koshavcha are allowed to marry them. So now the Gemara says, what happened? What is the halacha of a Petua Daka who is a Kohen? Does he lose the isurim of kahuna? Is he allowed to marry a Gioris and a Meshucheres, who are usually not allowed to marry a Kohen because they have a din of zona because of their previous activities? So the Gemara says, the question centers around, does a Petua Daka lose his Kedusha? Does a Petua Daka get lowered from his status of a Kahuna? Is the reason that a Petua Daka is Yisrael, not allowed to marry Kal Hashem, is because he himself doesn't count as Kal Hashem? He loses his Kedusha as Yisrael as far as that's concerned? If that would be the case, the same thing should apply to Kahanim. They should lose their Kedusha as Kohen and be allowed to marry a Gioris or a Meshucheres. So the Gemara says, let's try to work this out by seeing a discussion about, is a Petua Daka allowed to marry a situation where a regular Yisrael would not be allowed to marry? Is he allowed to marry outside Kahal Hashem? If a Petua Daka Yisrael is allowed to marry outside the Kol, then a Petua Daka Kohen should also be allowed to marry a Gioris or a Meshucheres and lose Kedusha as Kohen. So the Gemara says, we have a statement. Rav Sheshes says, we learned in a Brisa, Petua Daka Yisrael is allowed to marry a Nesina. Nesina is someone from the nation of Givonim. Givonim were Chivim, and they were from the Shiva Alamim. They're from the 7 nations of Canaan. They were not supposed to be allowed to convert and marry into Klal Yisrael. However, they pulled a trick and they pretended to be someone else, and Yeshua was Megayer them. So we accepted them as Gerim, which usually we wouldn't do from the Zainamus. We accepted them as Gerim, but they were not allowed to marry. We did not allow them to marry into Yisrael. However, it says that a Petua Daka is allowed to marry them. So what's the reason? It must be that a Petua Daka loses his status of Kedusha, and therefore that's why Petua Daka Yisrael is allowed to marry Nesina. By the same logic, a Petua Daka Kohen should be allowed to marry Yisuri Kahuna. So Gemara says that's not correct. The reason that a Petua Daka Yisrael is allowed to marry a Nesina has nothing to do with the fact that he loses Kedusha. Really, he has his Kedusha. The reason he's not allowed to marry them is because the only Isser is Gzeira D'Rabbanan, and the Gzeira D'Rabbanan doesn't apply to a Petua Daka. What's the Isser? So the Gemara says as follows. The Torah says, Lo Tischatein Bam. You cannot marry anybody from the 7 Umayis. That's an Isser D'Oraisa only when they are Goyim. These Nesinim, the Nesina converted. So there is no Isser D'Oraisa of Lo Tischatein Bam. What there is Gzeira D'Rabbanan, which we shall see later in the Fayin Ches, was made by David HaMelech and his Vezdin. That Isser D'Rabbanan was only made in a situation where there could be children born. What's the reason for that? The Isser D'Oraisa of Tischatein Bam is only because the child of a marriage to a guy will end up being Avodah Zarah. So when they extended that to a Nesina who converted and is now not a guy, doesn't have the Isser, they made it in the same format. It was only to a situation where you could possibly have a child who is going to marry, who could be born, who, had they been Goyim, would go be Avodah Zarah. Since it's a D'Rabbanan, they could create the rules however they wanted, and therefore they said that if it's someone who can't give birth, you don't have to worry about being over Avodah Zarah. We're not going to make the Gzeir here. Now, if it would be a D'Oraisa, the Isser of Tischatein Bam applies even to somebody. The Isser of marrying a guy, especially from the Zayin Umos, applies to somebody even if he was never going to give birth, because the Torah just gave a general rule. You cannot define where you think it applies and where it does not. However, since the reason for the rule was that the child be over Avodah Zarah, when the Rabbanan made a Gzeira, they used that definition in their Gzeira. Only a situation where a child will be born do we have an Isser. Therefore, a Petua Daka who's never going to have a child who is going to have an Isser, this D'Rabbanan of Nesina does not apply. But his Kedusha is fine. There's nothing wrong with his Kedusha, and therefore you cannot determine anything from there about a Kohen Petua Daka marrying someone who's not appropriate for Kohanim. So the Gemara says, if this is correct, if it's correct what you're saying, that the Isser is only D'Rabbanan, and the Rabbanan left out somebody who cannot have children, it's not part of that Isser, then a mamzer who is able to have children should not be allowed to marry a nisin, because a mamzer is in the Gzeira. A mamzer does have children, and the child of a mamzer is a full-fledged Jew. You don't want to be Avodah Zarah, and he should be allowed to marry a nisin because the Gzeira shouldn't apply. Why is it that mamzerim are allowed to marry nesinim? Like we've seen in the Mishnah, it says explicitly, mamzerim and nesinim are mutter levo zebezeh. They're allowed to marry each other. Obviously, it's not about having children or not having children. It's about a puzzle. Mamzer is a puzzle, nesin is a puzzle, and psulim are allowed to marry each other. So says the Gemara, no, I'll say it is the Rabbanan, and my rule does apply, but the Rabbanan was only made on ksherim. The rule, the Rabbanan was not made on psulim. That being the case, you cannot learn anything about Kohen to Petua Daka, a Kohen Petua Daka to a Gioris or a Mishacharis, because is still not talking about Kedusha. It's not a din Kedusha here. It's just telling you the way the Rabbanan made the rule. They left out psulim. They left out a mamzer. They left out a Petua Daka. They're definitely psulim. They left that out of the Isser to Nesina. But as far as losing Kedusha, you don't see anything. So then the Gemara said that Rava said this whole thing is wrong. This whole idea that it's only D'Rabbanan and the Rabbanan left out certain things from their Gzeira is wrong. The Isser of a Nesina is not a D'Rabbanan, it's a D'Oraisa. The reason we thought it was D'Rabbanan because we understood that the Isser D'Oraisa was only talking about before they converted. It's Lo Tischatein Bam is talking about before they converted. Says Rava, the Isser of Lo Tischatein Bam is not talking about before they converted. The Isser of Lo Tischatein Bam is talking about after they convert. It's got to be, because before they converted, the term tischatin doesn't apply. There's no chasnus, there's no marriage, there's no tfisas kedushin on an akum. So it couldn't say lo tischatin bam before they convert. There's no concept of chasnus on an akum. It's saying lo tischatin bam even when they convert. So these nesinim are akum from the Sheva Umos who converted. That the Torah says lo tischatin, that's a deraisa, and it's not correct to define it as based on Gezer Darban. It has nothing to do with that. And if they're allowed, if a Petua Daka is allowed to marry them, it must be because they don't have the Kedushas Yisrael, and therefore that's why they should be allowed to. So the Gemara is a kash on this. The Gemara says your argument, Rava, is based on the concept that there is no chasnos on an akam. The Torah couldn't use the word lo tischatein, referring to an akam before they convert. But it says that Shlomo Melech was vayischatein Shlomo es bas Paro Melech of Mitzrayim. Shlomo married, the word chasnos is used there, to bas Paro, the daughter of Paro, king of Mitzrayim. Now he did that as part of a peace treaty. Understand, but the term chasnos is applied to a guy there. So how could you tell me that there can't be? And therefore it makes a lot of sense to say when it says lo tischatein mom, it's talking about before they convert, if they're not converted. So the Gemara says, no, you don't have a kash from Shlomo HaMelech. He converted Bas Paro. So the Gemara says, well, how could you say that? Gerim were not accepted in the days of David and Shlomo HaMelech. The Gemara says, no, not a problem. The reason Gerim weren't accepted in the days of David and Shlomo HaMelech is because they wanted the good living conditions that Klal Yisrael had. This woman is Bas Paro. She's a princess. You cannot possibly suspect her of converting for good living conditions, and therefore someone like that, someone from royalty, they would accept. And that's what she did. So the Gemara says, there's a different problem. She's a mitzvah. Even if she's a giores, even if she converts, that wouldn't solve the problem. It's also for a mitzvah and a second generation converted mitzvah to marry a Yisrael. So how could Shlomo HaMelech marry her? How could the term chaslos apply? The Gemara says, maybe you'll tell me that Mitzrayim of today is not Mitzrayim. The Yisr of Mitzri only applied to Mitzrayim at the time of Yitzias Mitzrayim. All those Mitzrayim died. The entire nation was wiped out. They were all drowned in the Yam Suf. Other people came and lived in the region called Mitzrayim. Call themselves Mitzrayim now, but they're not real Mitzrayim. The Yisr of Mitzri until Dar Shlishi doesn't apply. The Gemara says it's not correct, because anybody who lives in Mitzrayim is counted as a Mitzri even today. And I see that because you have a brisa that shows that the Isser Mitzri still applied. Yehuda says that there's a fellow by the name of Min Yamin. He was a Ger Mitzri. He was from Talmidei Rabbi Akiva, and he said, I know I can't marry a Yisrael because I'm a Mitzri. I'm a Ger Mitzri. He went and married a woman who was also a Ger Mitzris. Giores Mitzris. She couldn't marry anybody else either. They went and had a child. He said, I'm going to marry this child off to a second generation Mitzris as well. That way, the child of both of them will be a third generation Mitzris and will be permitted to marry any Yisrael. So you see the concept of Mitzris and Mitzri and all those assumes still apply. So the Gemara therefore says, you can't learn anything out of Shlomo HaMelech. You want to say when the Torah says that he married, that there's chasnos, and you see that there is chasnos, you can't learn anything from Shlomo. Shlomo didn't do chasnos. Shlomo didn't marry her. Shlomo just lived together with her. He didn't do a technical marriage. How do you see that? Because it says, he was together with someone who Hashem said not to marry because because it's going to, she will turn your heart away. And then the pasuk continues, says, Bohem Dovak Shlomo Lahava. Shlomo stuck to them with love. This was not a marriage. He just stuck to her with love. There was no wedlock here. So the Gemara says, why does it say Yischatein? The Gemara says, because of his tremendous love, we refer to it disparagingly as a chasana. But there was no actual technical chasnas there, and therefore you cannot learn the rules of chasnas out of what Shlomo HaMelech did. So the Gemara says, Ravina said to Rav Ashi, we have a Mishnah that says, this is another attempt to solve our question of is a Petzuadaka lose Kedusha. So we have our Mishnah that says, Petzuadaka and Shavcha are mutter to marry a Gioris and a Mishachreres. Obviously that implies that it is us of them to marry a Nesina. Us of that they're not allowed to marry a Nesina. We said earlier that they are. Implication would be now that they're not. Only Gioris and Mishachreres are allowed to marry. But someone who doesn't qualify for Kedushas Yisrael is also for them to marry. So the Gemara says, no, you can't make a diak like that because the end of the Mishnah says they're only asur on Lovul B'Kahal Hashem. They're only asur on someone who's not counted as Kahal. But Nesina, they're permitted. So you have conflicting mashmayos as to whether Petzuadaka is allowed to marry Nesina. Therefore, you can't learn out of there whether Petzuadaka Kohen is allowed to marry someone with less kedusha or not, and we don't have a determination on the subject. Okay, this concludes this discussion. Now the Gemara brings our next Mishnah. The Mishnah discusses the halacha of Ammoni, Moavi, Mitzri, and a Daimi. So the Mishnah says as follows: an Ammoni, someone from Ammon, a male from Ammon, a Moavi, a male from Moav, they are not allowed to marry, and their Isser applies to all generations, even if they convert. Endless generations afterwards are not allowed to marry a regular Yisrael. However, females are allowed to convert and marry right away. Now, that's Amani and Mayavi. Mitzri and Adaimi, their Isser only applies 3 generations, up to 3 generations. And after 3 generations, they're allowed to. Now, what about a female Mitzri and Adaimi? So the Tanakh says that here the Isser applies to females as well. Rosh Shimon says females are mutter. Says Rosh Shimon, I have a simple argument. You have a Kavul Chomer. If Amoni Me'avi are Asr forever, and Mitzri and Adaimi are only Asr 3 generations, but Amonis and Mayavis are mutter, so then a Mitzri, a Mitzris, and an Edaimis, which are lighter, there is only past 3 generations, should certainly be mutter, and the Isser shouldn't apply to them. It should be mutter right away without having to wait any generations. So the Gemara says they answered him and they said, look, if you have a Mesorah for that halacha, we'll accept it. If you're just making the argument on your own based on that Kal V'chomer, we could reject the Kal V'chomer. The Mishnah doesn't say how. The Gemara will discuss how on a later daf. So he answered them and he said, first of all, you can't reject my Kal V'chomer. It's perfectly solid. Second of all, it is, I have a halacha, I have a Mesorah that this is the situation, and you, even if you were able to argue on the Kal V'chomer, which you can't, you would still have it. So the Gemara now begins discussing what is the source of the halacha that an Amonis and a Mayavis are allowed to marry into Kahal. They don't have to wait. This only applies to the males of Ammon and Moav. So this is going to be a lengthy discussion of a sugya in Sefer Shmuel. The Gemara will not conclude the discussion on this daf. So what's the source? So the Gemara says, Rav Yochanan says, the Torah says in Sefer Shmuel, when Shaul was fighting war against the Pelishtim, he needed somebody to fight Goliath. David, who was a young man, he was a youth, he was a lad, he stepped forward and said he's going to do it. So the pasuk says, Kirel Shaul as David Yotze L'Kas HaPelishti, when Shaul saw David going towards Goliath, Omer al Avner Saratzav, he said to Avner, the commander in chief of the army, Ben mi Zahanar Avner. Avner, who is this child, the son of? Now, Avner answered, Avner Chaynaf Melchem Yadati. He said, by your life, I have no idea. So the Gemara says, how could Shaul not know who David was? David played music for him, and David carried his armor. David served Shaul HaMelech. He knew him very well. Like it says in an earlier pasuk, Vayehavoi me'oid. Shaul loved David very much. Vahilei noisei Kalim. Shaul had been in a depression, and David was brought in to play music for him, and he was carrying his things. So he knew who he was. So the Gemara said he was asking about David's father. He didn't say who's this lad. He said, who is this lad a son of? He was asking about the father. So Gemara says, no, he couldn't have been asking about the father because Yishai, who was David's father, was a very well-known person. Like it says, V'ha'ish, and the man, which the Gemara says that Rav or Rabbi Abba said refers to Yishai, the man, Bimei Shaul Zakin Baba Anashim. He was somebody who was elderly and came in with a big crowd of people. And he would go in with thousands of people went with him. He was a very well-known individual. So everybody had to know who he was. So what was Shaul asking? He knew who David was. He knew who David's father was. What was he asking? So the Gemara says he was asking, we know it's from Shevet Yehuda. Is he from Peretz or Zerach? Yehuda had 2 sons, Peretz and Zerach. Which one is he from? If he's from Peretz, then he's possible to be king. He could end up being the king because the kings of Yehuda come from Peretz. You see that? Because the halach is that a melech pirates laso is derech ve'im namchem biyadei. A king is allowed to make himself a pathway wherever he needs to go, and you can't stop him. So the word Peretz applies to a king. Zerach, no such thing. If he's from Zerach, he may be a very honored, respected person, but he's not a threat to become a king. So this Gemara, how did Shaul know anything was going to become of him? He knew he was going to be something, either from Zerach, he would just be Chashiv, or Peretz a king. So the Gemara says he could tell because when David put on Shaul's armor, it miraculously fit. And Shaul was head and shoulders taller than everybody else. David was not. So it changed to fit. That Nes that he saw showed him something special was going to happen. So he was asking, is this kid fit to be king? And if he was, obviously he was concerned. So the Gemara says that Doeg HaDemi was there. And he said, before you ask if he's fit to be king, ask if he's fit to marry a Jew. Because he's descended from Rosa Moyavia, and Moyavim are Aser. So he's a Moyavi. He's descended from Moyav. He's a Moyavi. And he's not even allowed to marry a Jew, let alone become king. So the Gemara says Avner was there, and Avner said, no, we know that the halacha is amoini v'lei amoinis, me'avi v'lei me'avis. The Isser only applies to male moyavim, not to females. So Daig asked back, if that's true, you're going to say, because it says amoini v'lei amoinis, amoini means a male, and moyavi means a male, so when it says mamzer, it doesn't say mamzeres. It should also only mean that a male mamzer is also not a female. The Avner answered, he said, no, mamzer is a contraction of the word mumzar, that his blemish is that he was formulated from a woman being together with a stranger. That applies to anyone who's formulated from a woman being together with a stranger. So that applies even to females. There's also a mumzar. So Zaig answered, well, then the same thing should apply to a mitzri. It also says mitzri. It doesn't say mitzris. You're going to tell me that the Isser mitzri only applies to a male, not to a female? So the Gemara says, no, it's different, because a reason is given for the Isser on Amoinim, and therefore it applies to Mayavim as well, because they're mentioning it together. The reason for the Isser on Amoinim is because the Torah says specifically, don't marry into them, because when we were passing through, they did not come greet you with bread and water. And therefore the Isser only applies to men. Men are the ones who come greet travelers with bread and water. Women are not expected to do that, and therefore there's no Isser on the women. So the Gemara says that Doeg wasn't done. He said, no, the women should have at least greeted the women. The women, the Ammonis should have greeted the Yisraelis with bread and water. Why didn't they at least do that? This, Avner was stuck. He didn't have an answer. So the Gemara says, right then, Shaul HaMelech said the next pasuk that follows in the list of psukim we're discussing here. He said, Sha'alata ben mizeh ha'elim. Again, he repeated, he said, ask, who is this Elam? Who is this young man? But now we changed, we switched the word nar to the word Elam. Why did he change and use the word Elam now? Same meaning, but why did he say Elam? So that's from the word nisalma, that it's missing. The halacha was lost from you. Avner didn't know the halacha. So Shaul was saying, go check the halacha, go to the Beis Medrash and ask, is he mutter lava bakal or not? Is there a heter of Rus being a moyavis or not? So he went and asked in the Beis Medrash, and they said, no, it says, Amoini v'lei amoinis, me'avi v'lei me'avis, David HaMelech's fine. Doeg came and asked all his kashas, and they had no answer. They didn't have an answer to the same kasha. So the Gemara therefore says they wanted to go ahead and decree that David was also lavo bekal. They wanted to change this halacha. But the story's not over. There was more challenges coming up from more psukim, but that's on the next daf, and we'll get to that on daf Ayin Zayin.